Ciao amici value investor, la Cina farà la fine del Giappone? Questo è quello che molti si chiedono, cioè la Cina avrà un lungo periodo di grave deflazione a cui seguirà recessione e magari un decennio perduto? Inoltre c'è il problema demografico, l'invecchiamento della popolazione è un grave problema per la Cina. Allora, queste domande sono state fatte ad un analista della Nikko Asset Management, che è uno degli asset manager più grandi dell'Asia. E in realtà abbiamo già provato a dare alcune risposte a queste domande in una recente live e molte conclusioni di questo analista sono simili a quelle che abbiamo dato in live. Quindi, se vi siete persi la live, vi invito a guardarla. Ma adesso bando alle ciance e andiamo a vedere subito un estratto dell'intervista a questo analista a cui gli è stato chiesto se la Cina è come il Giappone degli anni 90.
Comparison between China and Japan. I can appreciate why people started comparing them. There are some similarities, but there are importantly a lot of major differences as well. So the first difference is that China today is very different from Japan in the 90s, especially in terms of potential GDP growth. And secondly, if you look at the property bubble, the asset bubble that we see in China today, again, that is not as big as what we saw in Japan in the 90s. Just comparing property value as a percentage of GDP, Japan in the 90s was about 560%. China is less than half of that at 260%. And importantly, Japan also had a huge stock market bubble in the 90s. Stocks were trading well above 60 times, whereas if you look at the HSCEI today in China, that's at a mere 7.5 times PE, which is a very low level. And the next point is in terms of what happened when the bubble burst in the 90s was that the Japanese government decided that they needed to tighten monetary and fiscal policy in a very extreme manner. Whereas in China, the policy environment is still extremely easy. Financial conditions are getting easier, if anything. And the next point is that China has a very stable currency right now, whereas Japan in the 90s, what happened was that the yen appreciated more than 200%, which made Japan extremely uncompetitive. And the other thing that people have been talking a lot about is the demographics issues in China today that is very similar to that of Japan. Yes, we know that China is aging. In fact, if you look at the working age population, that has kind of peaked a couple of years ago. But I'm actually still fairly comfortable with the demographics for next 10 to 15 years. Why? Because retirement age is still fairly low in China. It's for females, it's about 55 years old. And for males, it's about 60. So there is a lot of room to move that up. And the last point I will just talk about is that, I mean, the Western press would always talk about how China has a debt issue. But in our opinion, China's problem is not having too much debt, but in fact, they have too little debt. Let me explain that a little bit more. I think you can certainly argue that China has a problem with debt concentration, especially in areas like property. But the problem for China today is its big savings imbalance. China has one of the highest savings rates in the world today. And if you compare that to their investments, there is a huge excess savings. And on their debt level, if you look at China's private debt, it is actually, in fact, lower than that of the US, South Korea, Japan. And public debt-wise, China is at 71%, which is significantly lower than that of the US and Japan today. So, and the other thing that you have to consider is that the Chinese government also owns a lot of assets. And if you take all those assets into consideration, their balance sheet is actually net cash. So the bottom line here is that China, with its high savings economy, they will need a lot more debt creation and accumulation. The bigger the savings pool, the more borrowing and lending needs to be done.
Allora ragazzi, queste erano le considerazioni dell'analista e se vi interessa nel nostro gruppo Discord del Circolo dei Value Investor abbiamo degli appassionati di economia cinese che scrivono tutti i giorni dando notizie, dati, condividendo dubbi e paure sull'economia cinese, anche se personalmente non ci spenderei troppo tempo sulla macroeconomia in generale, cioè a mio avviso è perfettamente inutile leggere ogni giorno notizie macro. Comunque, se volete entrare nel gruppo vi basterà supportarmi con una piccola donazione su Patreon, link in descrizione, e fatemi sapere la vostra opinione sull'economia cinese nei commenti, un like al video se vi è piaciuto e ci vediamo alla prossima. Ciao da Davide.